I wasn't looking for a conspiracy when I started digging into the architectural history of rural hospitals and state-sponsored charities. I was merely researching the evolution of 19th century medical infrastructure, specifically the sudden explosion of massive ornate asylums, sanitariums, and so-called utopian communes built between 1850 and 1900. I wanted to understand the logistical supply chains of the era, the transition from local brickyards to industrial stone quarries. But what I found buried in the high-resolution photographic archives and the dusty census records did not point to medical innovation. It pointed to something far more unsettling. It pointed to a deliberate cash surgical quarantine, not a quarantine of disease, but a quarantine of memory. Look at the photographs of these early institutions. We are told these were benevolent utopian camps, designed with sweeping bat-wing floor plans and towering central administration buildings to provide fresh air and light to the afflicted. Zoom in on the sheer scale of the stonework. Notice the surgical precision of the masonry, the towering spires that pierce the sky like ancient antennas, the oxidized copper domes resting heavily atop mathematically perfect octagonal cupolas. These are not mere hospitals. They are palaces. They are fortresses of limestone, granite, and red brick, boasting hundreds of thousands of square feet of floor space, deliberately isolated deep in the countryside, miles away from the prying eyes of the newly established urban centers. The official narrative is simple, neat, and contained. We are told that during the mid to late 19th century, a sudden wave of moral reform swept through the nation. Philanthropists and local governments supposedly pooled their limited post-war resources to construct these breathtaking architectural marvels to house a mysteriously booming population of the mentally ill, the destitute, and the orphaned. We are asked to believe that state legislatures, operating on shoestring budgets in an era of horse and buggy logistics, authorized the quarrying, transportation, and assembly of millions of tons of permanent stone to build opulent castle-like resorts for society's most unwanted. But when you look closer at the construction timelines and the physical reality of these structures, the official explanation collapses. The math simply does not add up. Consider the sheer volume of these asylums, dozens of which appeared almost simultaneously across the continent, echoing identical architectural motifs in Europe and Australia. We are told they were built in mere years using primitive scaffolding, hand chisels, and steam-powered cranes at a time when the surrounding towns consisted of little more than wooden shacks and muddy dirt roads. How do you carve the negative space under a limestone cornice with such unsettling precision using only a hammer and chisel? How do you lay foundations 12 meters deep for a building spanning a quarter of a mile in an era before mechanized earth-moving equipment? And then there is the deeply unsettling question of the inhabitants. Who were the people filling these massive, echoing corridors? The historical records claim they were suffering from vague ailments like hysteria, melancholia, nostalgia, or simply overstudy. But if you examine the vast numbers of adults and children processed through these imposing walls, a much darker hypothesis begins to form. What if these sprawling, palatial estates were not built by 19th century reformers at all? What if they were inherited? What if they were the remnants of a prior, highly advanced global civilization, a Tartarian society, that were simply found, excavated, and repurposed by the inheritors of this realm? If that is true, then the purpose of these utopian institutions shifts dramatically. They were not hospitals, they were holding facilities. When a civilization is subjected to a massive reset, when the timeline is fractured and a new, inferior narrative is overlaid onto the ruins of the old, the new controllers face a monumental problem. What do you do with the survivors? What do you do with the adults who vividly remember the world before the mud flood, before the skies darkened, before the free atmospheric energy grids were systematically dismantled. You cannot simply execute them all without leaving a catastrophic historical footprint. Instead, you isolate them. You label their memories of a beautiful, abundant past as delusions. You lock them away in the very palaces their own ancestors built, reclassifying architectural masterpieces of a lost golden age as insane asylums. Look at the eyes of the patients in these archival photographs. They do not look frantic or violent. They look profoundly lost. They look like people who have been grieving an unfathomable loss, systematically stripped of their heritage, their families, and their truth. We are told the vast orphan trains of the exact same era were a charitable effort to populate the West, yet they parallel this exact same system of familial severing, relocation, and reprogramming. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The grand asylums, the isolated utopian communes, the remote sanitariums, they were the original re-education camps, designed with one singular purpose: to silence the witnesses of a stolen world. If you are finding this investigation valuable, please subscribe to keep this research alive. And tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? Have you noticed these anomalies in your own streets? Let us step away from the historical ledgers for a moment and look strictly at the physical reality of these structures through the lens of pure logistics. When you strip away the romanticized Victorian tales of benevolent philanthropy, you are left with a staggering mathematical contradiction. Consider the sheer mass of a typical late 19th century state hospital or utopian commune. We are talking about complexes that routinely featured over 1 million square feet of floor space, team is corspiency stretching for miles across rural, undeveloped landscapes. The official narrative asks us to accept that state legislatures, operating in an era recovering from massive civil conflict and economic depressions, somehow sourced, transported, and assembled millions of tons of limestone, granite, and sandstone. And they supposedly did this using nothing more than wooden carts, draft horses, hand chisels, and rudimentary steam engines. Look at the archival photographs of the alleged construction sites of these massive camps. Notice what is missing from the frame. The silence is deafening. Where are the vast armies of master masons? Where are the industrial-scale supply chains required to move monolithic blocks of granite from quarries hundreds of miles away? In the mid to late 1800s, the roads leading to these remote rural locations were little more than rutted dirt paths that turned to impassable mud for a third of the year. Yet, we are told that fleets of horse-drawn wagons, limited by the biological endurance of the animals and the physical constraints of wooden axles, transported the equivalent of modern skyscrapers piece by piece. If the official narrative is true, the sheer volume of wagon traffic alone would have required logistical networks rivaling a major theater of war. The math simply does not work. It is a logistical impossibility. Zoom in on the material science and the architectural execution of these structures. The stonework is not merely functional, it exhibits an unsettling precision. We see seamless joinery in massive limestone blocks, perfect load-bearing arches spanning vast distances, and intricate geometric facades that serve absolutely no medical purpose. Why would a cash-strapped local government authorize the staggering expense of carving ornate classical columns and intricate stonework for a facility designed to hide the mentally broken from public view? Why cap these buildings with massive, complex copper domes? These domes, often oxidized to a brilliant green, are architectural marvels that rival the greatest cathedrals of Europe. In the context of a rural asylum, they are an absurd extravagance. Unless, of course, they were never meant to be asylums, unless the copper domes and the towering spires were functional components of a lost technology, perhaps designed for the harvesting of atmospheric energy or the generation of specific healing frequencies, before they were stripped and repurposed by a what? Society that no longer understood how they worked. Furthermore, the internal layouts of these buildings completely betray their supposed 19th century origins. Examine the long, sweeping corridors of the Kirkbride-style institutions. They feature impossibly high ceilings, massive windows intended to flood the spaces with natural light, and an acoustic resonance that is mathematically perfect. If you have ever stood inside one of these abandoned hallways, you know the sound carries with a crystalline clarity. Why would a society supposedly terrified of the screams of the insane design resonance chambers that amplify every echo? It is a structural contradiction. The architecture implies a civilization that valued beauty, light, and acoustic harmony. It implies a civilization that built these palaces for abundance and high-frequency living, not for confinement, sickness, and suffering. Then, we must look down. We must look at the earth itself. Across the world, in nearly every one of these isolated rural palaces, we find the exact same architectural anomaly that plagues our urban centers, the half-buried basement level. Look at the photographs of the ground floors. You will see massive, ornate, fully articulated windows plunging straight into the soil, with the modern ground level cutting them off at the halfway mark. The official narrative tries to wave this away as settling or basement lighting. But you do not carve intricate master-level masonry arches only to deliberately bury them under 6 feet of dirt and mud. These buildings were not built into the ground. The ground rose to swallow them. They are survivors of the mud flood, the cataclysmic event that buried the lower levels of the Tartarian infrastructure. The 19th century controllers did not lay the deep foundations of these asylums. They simply dug them out, cleared the mud from the upper floors, and claimed them as their own construction. Who paid for this? In the decades immediately following brutal civil conflicts, where did the capital originate to fund dozens of these monolithic structures simultaneously across different states and nations? The official record presents a confusing web of philanthropic donations and vague state bonds, but the ledgers are suspiciously thin when it comes to the actual procurement of millions of tons of raw material. Even more baffling is the invisible workforce. If you look at the census records of the small rural towns adjacent to these massive projects during their supposed years of construction, the populations remain stagnant. There is no massive influx of tens of thousands of laborers, no sprawling shantytowns to house the stonemasons, carpenters, glassblowers, and engineers required to execute such gargantuan tasks. The men simply do not exist in the records. We are expected to believe that ghost armies materialized from the ether, built architectural wonders, and vanished without leaving a single diary, a single labor union record, or a single photograph of the work in progress. This brings us to the most uncomfortable realization of all, the core of what I call the inheritance theory. We are not the builders of this world. We are the inheritors. We are occupying the ruins of a global civilization that possessed an understanding of engineering, geometry, and material science that vastly eclipses our own. We are like hermit crabs wandering across the desolate beach of history, finding the magnificent, empty shells of a superior species and crawling inside to make them our homes. The 19th century elite did not build the Utopian camps, the grand sanitariums, or the sprawling asylums. They found them. They inherited a landscape dotted with the empty palaces of the Tartarian Empire, and when they needed a place to warehouse the survivors, the people who still remembered the old world, the people who resisted the new, downgraded narrative, the people who knew that the history books were being forged, they looked at these empty, magnificent shells. They took the soaring, light-filled palaces of their predecessors, installed iron bars over the beautiful, oversized windows, slapped heavy wooden doors on the airy corridors, and called them prisons for the mind. They used the stolen inheritance of a lost utopia to cage the very people who mourned its passing. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The entire history of 19th century institutional architecture is not a story of human progress and medical benevolence. It is a story of theft, retrofitting, and the logistical impossibility of a society claiming credit for masterpieces it could never have built. We started by looking at a few isolated hospitals in rural America. The official history asks us to treat these as localized anomalies, the pet projects of wealthy regional philanthropists and ambitious state legislatures. But when you pull back the lens, when you step away from the regional archives and look at the vast global maps of the late 19th century, the localized anomaly metastasizes into a worldwide impossibility. The architectural pattern we just examined does not just repeat across a few states. It repeats across oceans, across entirely different cultures, and across supposedly independent governments. Look at the blueprints and the early archival photographs of the Airedale Mental Hospital in Victoria, Australia, allegedly built in the 1860s. Now overlay that blueprint onto the Buffalo State Asylum in New York, supposedly constructed around the exact same time. Finally, place them both next to the plans for the Hôpital Sainte-Anne in Paris, or the massive psychiatric palaces in rural Russia. Notice the terrifying symmetry. We are looking at identical, massive, sprawling structures. They feature the exact same high-arched Palladian windows, the exact same intricate limestone cornices, the same rusticated ashlar facades, and the exact same mathematically perfect octagonal administrative towers piercing the sky. If we accept the official narrative, we are forced to believe that independent architects, separated by vast oceans and operating entirely on the slow, unreliable communication of 19th century steamships and rudimentary telegraphs, spontaneously decided to build the exact same multi-million square foot palaces for their respective insane populations. We are asked to believe that local stonemasons in the remote Australian bush independently developed the exact same highly advanced masonry techniques for carving impossibly precise, precise, copper-clad cupolas as the master masons in upstate New York, or the artisans in the heart of the French Empire. The coordination problem becomes impossible to ignore. How do you synchronize the construction of dozens of identical, architecturally flawless megastructures across the entire realm in an era before globalized industry, mechanized transport, or even standard international building codes? And it is not just the asylums. Once your eyes adjust to the pattern, it bleeds into every institution designed for control and containment during this specific, narrow window of time. Look at the so-called Utopian communes of the 1870s. Examine the massive fortress-like orphanages that suddenly appeared to house the children of the so-called orphan trains. Look closely at the stereoscopic photographs of the supposedly temporary World's Fairs, built around the exact same decade. The architectural DNA is identical everywhere you look. The sweeping Greco-Roman colonnades, the vaulted ceilings, the intricate masonry, the sheer, staggering scale that dwarfs the human form. If a society struggles to pave its own streets and relies on horses dragging wooden carts through the mud, it does not simultaneously construct global networks of limestone palaces merely to warehouse its most vulnerable citizens. Let us dig deeper into the foundations themselves. Look at the aerial surveys and the early cartographic maps of where these sprawling institutions were placed. Many of these massive hospitals were mysteriously built directly upon, or immediately adjacent to, existing geometric earthworks and massive star forts. The official historical record frequently claims these star forts were redundant 18th century military installations, abandoned and overgrown. But their sacred geometry is far too perfect. their placement too aligned with the grid of the asylums themselves. Why would a 19th century medical reformer deliberately choose the massive, difficult-to-excavate ruins of an obscure military battery as the foundation for a hospital? Unless, of course, the foundation was already there, acting as part of a global grid of atmospheric energy collection, and the hospital was simply a newly applied label to the upper, surviving levels of the original Tartarian structure. If this pattern is truly global, then the purpose of these repurposed buildings was also global. This was not a localized wave of medical philanthropy or a sudden, worldwide spike in mental illness. This looks increasingly like a synchronized, worldwide effort to quarantine the remnants of a prior population. Imagine the immense logistics of a global reset. You are the inheritor of a world filled with the towering, empty cities of the Tartarian civilization. You have a population of survivors, people who remember the old ways, people who understand the free energy grids, people who remember a decentralized, abundant society. You cannot integrate them into your new, industrialized, debt-based system of control. Their memories are incompatible with the new reality you are trying to construct. They are a threat to the new historical timeline. So across the entire realm, almost simultaneously, the new inheritors enact the exact same protocol. They identify the most remote, the most imposing, and the most structurally sound Tartarian palaces. They erect heavy iron gates around the perimeters. They change the zoning laws and the maps, and they begin to systematically filter the surviving population. The adults who ask too many questions, who refuse to accept the downgraded reality, are diagnosed with melancholia or hysteria and locked away in the echoing Kirkbride corridors. The children, whose memories are still malleable and innocent, are swept up into the massive, castle-like orphanages, systematically stripped of their family names, and sent westward on trains to work as manual laborers, their true heritage entirely erased from their minds before they can even understand what was stolen from them. Look at this archival map of the United States from 1880. Every red dot represents an asylum, a massive state orphanage, or an isolated sanitarium supposedly built within a frantic 30-year window. The dots cluster around the major population centers, but they are always pushed just to the periphery. They form a silent, undeniable ring of containment around the new, industrialized cities. Now look at the historical map of Europe for the same exact decade. You see the exact same ring of towering stone institutions. And in South America, and in the colonial outposts. We are not looking at the dawn of modern psychiatry or the triumph of 19th century charity. We are looking at the architectural footprint of a global purge. We are looking at the holding pens where the old world was systematically broken, categorized, and hidden away from the new generation. The sheer scale of this operation, mirrored on every continent with exact architectural precision, suggests a level of centralized planning and control that the history books absolutely refuse to acknowledge. The official narrative claims this was an era of independent nation-states fumbling their way toward modernity with hammers and chisels. But the stones themselves tell a vastly different story. The identical limestone arches, the matching oxidized copper domes, the perfectly aligned foundations, they whisper of a single, unified architectural language spoken across the entire realm, long before the 19th century inheritors arrived to claim it as their own. But how do you maintain a deception of this staggering magnitude? You cannot simply lock away thousands of witnesses in magnificent stone palaces and expect the timeline to rewrite itself organically. You must control the paperwork. You must systematically erase the evidence of who these people were before they were labeled as patients, inmates, or orphans. When we begin to pull at the loose threads of institutional archives from this specific era, the fabric of the official narrative does not just fray, it completely disintegrates. If you attempt to trace the genealogical records of the adults committed to these sprawling Kirkbride facilities between 1850 and 1890, you will inevitably hit a meticulously constructed brick wall. We are repeatedly told that record-keeping in the 19th century was simply poor, disorganized, or lost to the chaos of the times. But when you look at the tax ledgers, the railroad land grants, or the property deeds from those exact same years, the penmanship is flawless, and the ledgers are preserved with surgical precision. The state knew exactly who owned every acre of profitable land. Yet, when it comes to the identities, the origins, and the true medical justifications for incarcerating an entire generation of adults and shipping their children off on westward trains, the archives are suspiciously barren. The systematic destruction of memory requires an equally systematic destruction of data. Think about the catastrophic fires that mysteriously plagued the administrative wings of these rural asylums. Time and time again, we read historical footnotes detailing tragic, highly localized blazes that conveniently consumed the admission ledgers, the architectural blueprints, and the patient histories, while somehow leaving the massive limestone facades and the empty patient wards entirely untouched. Consider the tragic fate of the 1890 United States Census, largely destroyed in a 1921 fire in the basement of the Commerce Building. That specific census would have provided the ultimate demographic snapshot of the exact window when the asylum and orphan train populations reached their absolute peak. Its loss is treated by modern academics as a clumsy, unfortunate accident of history. But when viewed through the lens of a coordinated civilizational erasure, accidents begin to look exactly like protocol. The institutions responsible for safeguarding our collective memory flatly refuse to address these mathematical contradictions. When you ask the academic gatekeepers how millions of tons of stone were moved by horse, or why the patient records of the so-called Utopian camps vanished in selective fires, while tax records survived, the silence is deafening. This deliberate erasure extends far beyond the paper trail. It is violently etched into the architecture itself. What happens to a Tartarian palace once its purpose as a quarantine zone is fulfilled? Once the original survivors have passed on, and the new, downgraded generation has been thoroughly conditioned to believe the official timeline, the massive stone shells become a profound liability to the controllers. They are too grand, too perfect, too contradictory to the narrative of modern, incremental human progress. Enter the era of aggressive mid-century demolition. We are told that by the 1950s and 1960s, these magnificent million-square-foot palaces were suddenly obsolete and too expensive to maintain. Think about the sheer absurdity of this claim. The inheritors, who supposedly built these fortresses of limestone, granite, and copper with hand tools and wooden wagons a century prior, now claimed they lacked the modern technology and funds to simply keep the roofs intact. Look at the archival footage of the wrecking balls swinging into the intricately carved masonry of these state hospitals. Notice the sheer difficulty the demolition crews face. The stone pulses with a structural integrity that actively defies the cheap, modern explosives and diesel machinery used to bring them down. The walls do not crumble like 19th century brickwork. They resist, revealing internal iron frameworks and geometric joinery that the official record claims did not even exist at the time of their supposed construction. They were not demolishing outdated hospitals to make way for progress. They were destroying the physical evidence. They were wiping the architectural slate clean. This mirrors the exact same tactic used during the great world's fairs of the era. The inheritors found magnificent glowing cities, powered by atmospheric energy, labeled them temporary exhibitions, charged admission to the downgraded public, and then burned them to the ground or blew them up under the guise of urban renewal. The rural asylums suffered a slower, more clinical version of the exact same fate. Pulverized to hide the impossibility of their origins. we must carefully speculate about the implications of what I call the 19th century reset window. I am not claiming to know the exact date the skies shifted, the exact hour the free energy grids were dismantled, or the precise year the mud rolled through the streets of our global cities. But if we hypothesize a narrow window of transition, roughly between 1840 and 1890, everything we have looked at aligns with a chilling, mathematical precision. This was not an era of a booming industrial revolution. It was an era of civilizational recovery, demographic classification, and aggressive historical editing. The utopian camps, the grand asylums, the sprawling sanitariums, and the vast networks of orphan trains were the logistical apparatus of this reset. They were the sorting mechanisms for a fractured humanity. The old world was buried, both literally under the mud and figuratively under layers of forged paperwork and highly convenient fires. The names of the survivors were changed. Their ancestral heritage was legally and biologically severed. The magnificent buildings they once inhabited in freedom were retrofitted into cages for their minds, and when those cages were no longer needed to maintain the illusion, they were reduced to rubble. The controllers did not just steal the architecture, they stole the timeline itself, leaving us with nothing but ghost stories and empty, unexplainable ruins. Step back from the ledgers, the forged census records, and the mechanical impossibilities for a moment. What was actually lost? We look at the crumbling ruins of these rural state hospitals today, and we are conditioned to see haunted houses, places of terror, sorrow, and primitive medical experimentation. But look past the heavy iron bars and the reinforced doors added by the inheritors. Look at the sweeping corridors designed to catch the morning sun. Look at the mathematical perfection of the domes, meant to resonate with the natural frequencies of the earth. Imagine what it was like to live in a civilization where breathtaking beauty was not a luxury reserved for the ruling elite, but the absolute baseline of human existence. In the world before the reset, before the Great Mud Flood, and the subsequent historical quarantine, humanity did not live in gray concrete boxes. They did not toil for decades merely to pay for basic shelter and the right to consume heavily taxed, primitive fossil fuels. They lived in an era of absolute architectural and atmospheric abundance. The evidence etched into the surviving stones suggests a society that possessed a vitality and a harmony with their environment that we can barely comprehend today. The towering copper spires, the intricate finials, and the mathematically coiled ironwork were not just decorative architectural flourishes, they were the functional circuitry of a free, decentralized energy grid. They harvested the ambient electrical charge of the atmosphere, bathing these magnificent cities and sprawling estates in a soft, perpetual light that required no coal, no smokestacks, and no monthly ledgers. And with that ambient energy came a deep physiological harmony. The acoustic precision of those vaulted ceilings and octagonal cupolas points to a profound understanding of cymatics and sound healing. Our ancestors did not need the chemical interventions of the modern medical-industrial complex. They healed through frequency. They thrived in environments specifically designed to elevate the human spirit, surrounded by immortal stone that pulsed with life. Now look at what we have been given in exchange. Look at the sprawling, sterile suburbs, the crumbling infrastructure, the suffocating reliance on centralized utilities, and the pervasive, accepted epidemic of modern chronic illness. We have been systematically downgraded, but the true tragedy, the profound heartbreak that lies at the very core of this entire investigation, is not just that this utopian realm was destroyed. It is what they did to the survivors. Imagine being a citizen of that golden age. Imagine surviving the cataclysm, only to watch the new inheritors roll in with their steam trains, their rudimentary factories, and their brutal, debt-based economy. Imagine trying to explain to your children how the copper domes used to glow, how the water from the ornate street fountains used to heal, only to have the newly established authorities label you as a lunatic. The controllers did not just steal our history, they weaponized our own legacy against us. They took the very palaces designed for communal healing, atmospheric gathering, and spiritual elevation, and they turned them into prisons of the mind. They locked our great-grandparents inside their own magnificent creations. The survivors of Tartaria were forced to spend their final days wandering the echoing halls of the very buildings they or their parents might have constructed, looking out of grand, sweeping windows through freshly installed iron bars. They were isolated, broken, and studied like malfunctioning machinery by a mid-level bureaucratic institution that could not build a fraction of what those patients remembered. That is the profound, suffocating melancholy of the 19th century asylum. It is not a monument to early psychiatry. It is the tombstone of human potential. Once you understand the staggering magnitude of this theft, the world around you completely changes. You can no longer walk through a historic downtown district or drive past the imposing limestone ruins of a rural state hospital without feeling the profound weight of what was taken from us. You see the buried first floors. You see the impossible stonework that defies the tools of the era. You see the remnants of a glorious inheritance that was hijacked, repackaged, and sold back to us as a primitive linear history of human struggle. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The illusion of the official narrative shatters entirely. We are the descendants of the orphans placed on those westbound trains. We are the children of the amnesiacs, waking up in a gray, brutalist world, feeling a deep, intuitive homesickness for a breathtaking utopia we never got to see, but that our very bones remember.